The day my husband looked me in the eyes and said those four words, "You're replaceable," something inside me broke. It wasn't the kind of breaking that leaves you feeling helpless or small. No, it was the kind of breaking that shatters an old shell and leaves something raw and fierce in its place. I stood there, stunned into silence, my mind spinning as I tried to process how the man I had loved for years, the man I had built a life with, could be so cruel, so dismissive. In his mind, he had won. He thought those words had cut me down, reduced me to nothing, but he had no idea what he had just unleashed. Let me back up a bit. Our marriage hadn't always been like this. There was a time when we were happy, or at least I thought we were. We met in college, bonded over late-night study sessions and dreams of the future. He was charming, confident, and had this way of making me feel like the only person in the world. We got married a few years later, and for a while, life felt like a fairy tale. But somewhere along the line, things changed. His confidence turned into arrogance, his charm became manipulation, and the love I thought was unconditional began to feel transactional. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't doing enough to keep him happy. Maybe I wasn't pretty enough, smart enough, or successful enough. I bent over backward trying to please him, ignoring the red flags that began popping up more and more frequently. The snide comments about my appearance, the dismissive attitude toward my career, the way he always made me feel like I wasn't quite measuring up. It all added up, but I kept convincing myself it was just a phase. Then, one day, I found a text on his phone. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. The flirty tone, the inside jokes, the late-night timestamps. It was clear he was crossing boundaries with someone else. My heart sank, but instead of confronting him, I internalized the blame yet again. I told myself I just needed to try harder, to be the wife he wanted, to prove I was worth his love. Looking back now, I realize how deeply I had lost myself in the process. But the moment he uttered those words, "You're replaceable," everything changed. It wasn't just the words themselves that stung, but the casual, almost smug way he said them. Like he was daring me to challenge him, daring me to fight back. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, staring at him, and in that silence, a fire ignited within me. He may have seen my silence as submission, but in reality, it was the calm before the storm. That night, I lay in bed replaying his words over and over again in my mind. "You're replaceable." The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil, but it also gave me clarity. I realized that I had spent years bending, compromising, and losing pieces of myself to fit into a mold he had created. I had allowed him to convince me that my worth was tied to his approval, that my value was something he could define or diminish. But not anymore. I decided that I wasn't going to confront him, at least not yet. Confrontation would give him the power to twist my words, to turn the situation around and make me doubt myself all over again. No, I needed to approach this differently. I needed a plan. And so, I began quietly reclaiming my power, one step at a time. The first thing I did was take a hard look at my life, my career, my relationships, my passions, and, most importantly, the person I had become. I realized that over the years, I had given up so much of myself to fit into his world. I had stopped pursuing the hobbies that brought me joy, distanced myself from friends who cared about me, and even put my career ambitions on hold because he didn't think they were practical. It was time to change that. I reconnected with old friends, started attending networking events, and reignited my passion for photography, a hobby I had abandoned early in our marriage. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects and challenging myself in ways I hadn't in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself instead of for someone else. Of course, he noticed the changes. At first, he brushed them off, probably assuming they were just temporary distractions. But as weeks turned into months, and as I grew more confident and self-assured, his demeanor began to shift. He became more controlling, more critical, and more desperate to regain the power he felt slipping away. But no matter what he said or did, I remained calm and focused. I had made a promise to myself that I would never let him define my worth again. And then came the moment I had been preparing for. I knew that in order to truly break free, I needed to confront him, not with anger or tears, but with the quiet strength of someone who had reclaimed her identity. One evening, after dinner, I sat him down and told him everything. I told him how his words had hurt me, how his actions had eroded our marriage, and how I had finally realized that I deserved better. He tried to interrupt, to deflect, but I didn't let him. For the first time, I spoke my truth without fear or hesitation. When I was done, I stood up, handed him a neatly packed suitcase, and said, "You may have thought I was replaceable, but the truth is, you're the one I don't need." His jaw dropped, and for a moment, he was speechless. I turned and walked away, feeling a sense of liberation I hadn't felt in years. That was just the beginning of the story, though. What happened next was something neither of us could have anticipated, a twist that would change both of our lives forever. But that's for the second part. Stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. After I walked away that night, suitcase in his hands and my words lingering in the air, I felt a shift within me, a sense of closure that had been years in the making. But I wasn't content to simply walk away. His dismissiveness, his cruelty, and those words, "You're replaceable," deserved more than silence. I didn't want revenge, not exactly, but I wanted to make a statement. I wanted to create a life so whole, so extraordinary, that he would be forced to face the loss of what he'd taken for granted. I poured every ounce of my focus into rebuilding myself. My career, which I had once put on hold for his convenience, became my new passion. I worked late nights, pitched bold ideas, and took risks that paid off in ways I never imagined. Within months, I earned a promotion, and my confidence began to soar. Photography, the hobby I had abandoned early in our marriage, blossomed into a side business. My weekends filled with photo shoots, and my art gained traction in ways I hadn't dared to dream of before. My personal life also began to flourish. I reconnected with old friends, forming bonds that reminded me of what true support and care felt like. For the first time in years, I felt free to simply be myself, without judgment or critique. And while I wasn't looking for love, I allowed myself the possibility of it, because for the first time, I knew I deserved it. Meanwhile, he was unraveling. Mutual friends told me he wasn't taking the separation well. At first, he bragged about being single, acting as though he was thriving, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. He realized that the things he had dismissed about me, my kindness, my creativity, my strength, weren't so easy to replace. He reached out once or twice, testing the waters with casual texts, but I didn't respond. I knew better than to reopen that door. The final twist came unexpectedly. Months later, at a corporate gala for work, I crossed paths with him. He looked disheveled, as though life had worn him down. But what stood out most was his expression when he saw me, a mix of shock and regret. I was dressed in confidence, carrying myself with a strength he had never taken the time to notice. It was clear he hadn't expected to see me thriving, let alone surpassing the person I had been while with him. He approached me, his voice hesitant. "You look incredible," he said, searching for the right words. I nodded politely, but I didn't linger. He started to say something else, an apology perhaps, but I stopped him with a simple smile. "You were right, you know," I said softly. "I was replaceable, but not by anyone you'll ever meet." And with that, I walked away, leaving him standing there, a man who finally understood what he had lost. That night, as I reflected on the journey I had taken, I didn't feel anger or bitterness anymore. Instead, I felt gratitude, gratitude for the strength I had found, the life I had rebuilt, and the person I had become. His words had been intended to break me, but instead, they became the catalyst for my transformation. He had taught me the most valuable lesson of all. I was never replaceable, not to the people who truly mattered. And most importantly, not to myself.